We continue now at the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 3b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara raised the following contradiction between a statement of Rav Yehuda from Rav and a Braisa. On the previous Amud, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, let's say a person slaughters a carbon chatas as a carbon ola, so in that situation we say that the carbon is disqualified. However, if a person slaughters a carbon chatas as chulin, meaning as a non-carbon, then the carbon is not disqualified. And the difference between the two cases is that when a person slaughters a carbon chatas as a carbonola, that's considered minah, that's considered of the same kind. So minah is machriv ba. If it's of the same kind, so it destroys, so to speak, and it disqualifies. But if it's lav minah, if the person slaughters the carbon chatas as chulin, as a non-carbon, so then it's not of the same kind, and it does not destroy. And the Gemara asked a contradiction from a Braisa. The Braisa is discussing the halacha of tocho by klicheres, the halacha of that which is within a klicheres, within earthenware vessels. And the Braisa says that tocho is tamei. Anything that's within the earthenware vessel is tamei if there's something tamei that's within that earthenware vessel. However, tocho, let's say something is within a vessel that is within that vessel, so that's already protected. In such a situation, it is not going to be tamei. And the Braisa said that when we talk about tocho, even klishetef, even if it's not of the same kind of vessel, let's say you have within the earthenware vessel a metal vessel, so if it's in such a situation, again, it's going to be tocho, it's not going to be considered tocho, and even the klishetef is going to be matzel, is going to protect. And so the Gemara asks a question. The Gemara says, if something not of the same kind is not machriv, it's not considered to destroy, so to speak, so it also should not be chotzetz. And the klishetef is not of the same kind. It's made out of metal, even though the other outer vessel is made out of earthenware. And so in such a situation, again, it should not be machriv, it should not be matzel, and therefore we should say that's not considered to be tocho in such a situation, and in fact it actually should be tamei. And the Gemara on the previous Amud answered that in fact, when it comes to a kli shetef within a kli cheres, actually that is considered to be of the same kind. The reason why that's considered of the same kind is because they're both vessels, and so therefore, since it is considered to be of the same kind, it is machriv, so to speak, it is going to be chotzetz, and it's going to protect that which is inside. It's considered to be tocho. And the Gemara said that actually when it comes to slaughtering a carbon chatas as chulin, which is considered not of the same kind, if you're going to compare that to a case of tumah, it actually would be more comparable to a case in a Mishnah in Meseches Kalim. Because in the Mishnah in Meseches Kalim, it talks about a situation where you have an oven, and then you have a mechitza, you have a partition in an oven. And over there, the Mishnah actually says, according to the Tanna Kama, that the partition in the oven is not chotzetz in that situation. And we say that everything in the oven is tamei. And the reason why everything in the oven is tamei is because the mechitza of the partition is not of the same kind. Since it is not of the same kind, so it is not chotzetz. Again, the same idea that it's not machriv, it doesn't destroy, so to speak. And so in that situation, everything actually is tamei, and that would actually be more comparable to the case of slaughtering a carbon chatas as chulin, again, which is not of the same kind. And as the Gemara in the previous Amud was bringing the Mishnah, there's an opposing view within that Mishnah, and that is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that we find partitions actually are matzil. They actually do protect something from becoming tummy when it comes to an ohel ha-mace. Let's say you have a mace in a room, and then you have a mechitza, you have a partition. So then we say the objects on the other side of the partition are actually pure. And so since we say that, Rabbi Eliezer says, if we're going to say that in a situation of Oel HaMeis, so in this situation of Tocho, let's say you have a partition in that case, that certainly should be Matzil, and so therefore Rabbi Eliezer actually argues with the Tanna Kama in that Mishnah in Kalim, and again he says, if you're going to say that the tumah is that the item is protected in a situation of tumah by oel hamei, so you should say that over here also when it comes to tocho and tocho by the earthenware vessel. And the Tanna Kama now respond to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, you can't compare the two. Because im hitzel b'meis chamer shekein chaluka b'ohalin. When it comes to mace, which again you said is stricter, and that's true, Tumas mace is stricter, but there it's different because it's ohel, it's a Tumas ohel. Tatzel b'klicheres, are you going to say that there's going to be protection by klicheres when you have a partition hakal, which it's true, the Tumah is more lenient, but shein chalukin b'ohalin, but there, we're not talking about a situation of Tumas ohel. And Rashi explains, Im hitzel ha-mechitza b'meis ha-chamor, It is true that when it comes to a mechitza by tumas mace, we say that the mechitza protects that which is on the other side. Be ohel ha-mace, in a situation where you have an ohel ha-mace, you have everything under a roof where there is a mace, where there's a dead body. Shah-mechitza mafsekes, in that situation we say that the partition is considered to be an interruption, it is a separation. V'kelim sheme'ever hasheni tahorin, and the vessels on the other side are pure. T'chsiv kol asher ba'oel yitma, v'hani lav ba'hu oel ninu, because we say everything in the oel is tameh, and those kelim on the other side of the partition are not considered to be in that same oel, and they're tahor. But that's different. Shekain cholk, and Rashi has a slightly different girsa over here than we have in our Gemara. Instead of shekain chaluka, shekain cholkin means to say derech b'nei adam lachlok oholan b'mechitza. It's the way of people to divide up tents with partitions. Partitions are something that you find within an ohel, and so hilkach, therefore oel acharinahu, therefore it's considered to be another ohel, and that's why we say in that situation the partition is considered to be chotzetz, it separates, and we say that the items on the other side of the mechitza are tahor. But are you necessarily going to say that by an earthenware vessel? Tatzil b'klicheres, are you going to say a partition is going to save by klicheres? Bitmiya, this is like an expression of a question. She'ein chok and klicheres b'mechitzos, it's not the way of people to divide up klicheres with mechitzos. Hilkach tocho karina bay, therefore even if it's on the other side, so to speak, of the mechitza, it's still considered tocho of the klicheres, and it's going to be tameh. That's what the Rabbanan respond to Rabbi Eliezer. And the Gemara continues and says that this resolution of the contradiction, hateinach l'Rabbanan, it works out according to the Rabbanan. And Rashi explains, hateinach l'Rabbanan, it works out according to the Rabbanan, again in this Mishnah in Meseches Kalim, the Amri mechitza lo matzla, because again the Rabbanan are the ones that say, if you have a mechitza in the klicheres lo matzla, so it doesn't protect, and everything on the other side is going to be tameh, so isa l'derav, we can understand what Rav is saying. Again, Rav is saying in a situation of a chatos that is slaughtered as chulin, it's going to be kosher, that makes sense also, da'amar delav mine, because he says that which is not of the same kind, lo machriv bay, it doesn't destroy, and that's why the mechitza is lo matzla, it's the same idea, lo machriv bay. But the Gemara continues, Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the mechitza is effective, and it does protect things from becoming tamei on the other side by klicheres, so ma'ikol ameimar, so what are you going to say? And Rashi explains, Elul Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, ma'ikol ameimar, what are you going to say? Lema de Rav Tanoi, it would seem that the statement of Rav is actually subject to a machlokas Tanoim, because again, according to Rav, if it's not of the same kind, it should not be matzil, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, in fact, it is matzil in such a situation, based on the kal v'chomer from the tumah by Oel HaMeis. And the Gemara continues and answers, Rabbi Eliezer kal v'chomer ka'amar. Well, Rabbi Eliezer, he was relying on that kal v'chomer. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Eliezer kal v'chomer ka'amar. Rabbi Eliezer said a kal v'chomer liolam bialma. Really, Rabbi Eliezer karav svirale. Really, Rabbi Eliezer actually does hold like Rav. Kagon chulin v'kachim. For example, again, in a situation of chulin and kachim, it is lo machriv bay. It is not going to destroy. It's not going to disqualify. Avole inyan mechitza, but when it comes to a mechitza in an earthenware vessel, mikal v'chomer yolav, there he happens to have a kal v'chomer. So he has a kal v'chomer, kevan devimeis hachomer matzla, since we find that by oel ha-meis and meis stricter, we find that it does protect. So kal v'chomer liklicheres hakal sha'asheretz kal min ha-meis. So we make a kal v'chomer, if you have a partition in a klicheres, it should also save, it should also protect, because the tumah of a sheretz is more lenient than the tumah of a meis. And so therefore, fundamentally, Rabbi Eliezer actually would agree with the statement of Rav, but where you have a kal v'chomer, so there he follows the kal v'chomer. But the Gemara continues and says, if so, hasam nami lema kal v'chomer. There also, when it comes to the slaughtering of karbanos, we can also say a kal v'chomer. And the kal v'chomer would be as follows: kachim, mechalel, and kachim. If we're going to say that another kind of kachim, a different kind of carbon, is able to disqualify the carbon. In other words, again, you slaughter it with the intention, it's really a chatos, you slaughter it as an ola. If that's able to disqualify, so chulin lo kol shekain, so chulin, which is lesser than kachim, certainly it should disqualify. So if Rabbi Eliezer applies the kal v'chomer in the situation of tumah, he should apply the kal v'chomer over here as well. And so the Gemara continues and explains, Ela taima de Rav, rather the reason of Rav has nothing to do with what we have been saying. Again, we explained Rav, that if it's of the same kind, then it disqualifies. If it's not of the same kind, then it doesn't disqualify, and we understood that as a logical principle, but that actually is not the case. Rather, the reason of Rav is Rebbe Lazar. The reason of Rav is like Rebbe Lazar. The Yom Rebbe Lazar, because Rebbe Lazar says, my time de Rav, what's the reason of Rav? Why does Rav say that, again, if the person has in mind a different carbon, then it disqualifies, but if he has in mind chulin, it does not disqualify? It comes from the pasuk. It's actually simply a gzeres hakasav. The pasuk says, "V'lo yechalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael." And they shall not desecrate the sacred items of Bnei Yisrael, Eis Asher Yorimu LaHashem, that which is offered to Hashem. And we darshan from that pasuk, Kodshim Mechalin Kodshim, that Kodshim can desecrate other Kodshim, Ve'ein Chulin Mechalin Kodshim, but Chulin is not going to desecrate Kodshim. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garsin on the proper text is as follows, Elataima de Rav, the reason of Rav is Rebbe Lazar, it's like Rebbe Lazar, it's a Gezeres HaKosav, V'lo Yechalu es Kodshi Hachi Darshle, we're darshaning the pasuk as follows, Ein Davar Acher Mechalel as Kodshe B'nai Yisrael, nothing else, some other item is not going to desecrate the Kodshe B'nai Yisrael, Gezeres HaKosav, and again, it is a Gezeres HaKosav. But the Gemara continues and says, Alma, but still we see from that, Asa Kra Afke Mikal V'chomer, that a pasuk can come along and undo a Kal V'chomer. And so the Gemara says, if a pasuk can come along and undo a Kal V'chomer, so Hachanami, so here also, Lesi Tocho, the entire halacha by Tumah comes from a pasuk, it comes from the pasuk of Tocho. So the pasuk of Tocho should come along and Lifke Mikal V'chomer, it should undo the Kal V'chomer. Why is Rabbi Eliezer able to make a Kal V'chomer against the Gezeres HaKosav? If the pasuk says Tocho, and in this case, technically speaking, it really should be Tocho, because the partition that's within the vessel should not count as a partition to be matzil. So in such a situation, everything should be tamei. Why should Rabbi Eliezer be able to make a kal v'chomer from oel hameis, where we say the partition is matzil, the partition does protect it from becoming tamei? Why should he be able to make such a kal v'chomer and go against the pasuk? And the Gemara says to that, Hai tocho. No, the reason is because the word tocho over here is necessary for something else, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer is able to make the kal v'chomer. What is tocho needed for? Mi boy lei, he needs it for the following. La'ochlin shegiblon betit. Let's say you have food, and you need clay all around the food, v'hichnisan la'aver tanur, and then you enter it in the airspace of the tanur, of the oven, the earthenware vessel. And so in such a situation, sal kadai tachamina, one might have thought, ho'elu v'negia lo metame, since at this point it's completely surrounded and enclosed, and if you touched it, it wouldn't become tame. So ba'aviro nami lo metame, so in the airspace of this tame tanur, it also should not become tame. That's what one might have thought. And kamash malon, that's what the word tocho is teaching. This is still considered to be tocho, and therefore it's tame, and that's what we need the word tocho for. And since we're using the word tocho, so Rabbi Eliezer is able to make his kal v'chomer with regards to a partition, and say that when you have a mechitza in this tanur, still, when you have a mechitza in this tanur, the items are in fact tahar, they are in fact pure. For Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan respond to that, hanach lo tzrichi kra, the idea that when you need some clay around some food, the idea that in that situation it is tamei, you don't actually need a pasuk for that, and therefore there is in fact a pasuk of tocho, and even though we have a kal v'chomer, still the pasuk of tocho overrides the kal v'chomer, and therefore we don't make the kal v'chomer. And again, according to the Rabbanan, we say that if you have such a partition within this tanur, the items on the other side of the partition will in fact be tamei. And we will note 2 points over here. First, Rashi mentions that the drasha over here from the word tocho is actually a drasha from the extra vav at the end of the word tocho. And the second point is that when we talk over here about the carbon being puzzle, let's say in a situation, again, a carbon chatos, in which he had in mind that it's really a carbon ola, so we say in that situation that it's disqualified, that disqualification follows whatever we learned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says there are different carbonos have different levels of disqualification. Some are completely disqualified, and some it's just that they don't count towards the obligation of the owner, but the carbon itself does remain a good carbon. In any case, that's what we mean by disqualification, as the Mishnah explained. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. Rav Yosef Barami, Rami Shinoi Kodesh Shinoi Bailim. Rav Yosef Barami, he had a contradiction between Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim. Shinoi Kodesh is what we have been discussing until now. Let's say, for example, again, a person brings a carbon chatas, and instead he has in mind for a carbon ola. In that case, it's disqualified, again, as explained in our Mishnah. And he had a contradiction to Shinoi Bailim. Shinoi Bailim means that the person has in mind that it should be an atonement for a different owner. Umeshani, and he resolved that contradiction. Miyomar Rav, did Rav really say, the Masoras Hashah says, some have the girsa of Rava, did Rava really say, chatas shashachta l'shem chatas kashera, that let's say you have a chatas that was slaughtered for a chatas for a different kind of avera. Let's say, for example, it was a chatas that was really for chaylev, but the person had in mind that it was a chatas for an avera of dam, of blood, so that would be kosher. But l'shem ola psula, but if he slaughters a chatas that it should be an ola, so then it would be psula, then it would be disqualified, as we mentioned earlier. But in any case, Alma, what do we see from that halacha? The lav mina machriba, that if it's it's not of the same kind, so then it destroys it, then we say it disqualifies. That's the case of Ola. Demino lo machriba, but as long as you have in mind of the same kind, meaning again you have in mind that it's a carbon chatos, it's just that the person is thinking a chatos for a different avera, so that's lo machriba, that doesn't destroy, that does not disqualify. But did he really say that? V'amar Rav, but Rav said, again, there's a girsa of Rava instead, but Rava said, chatos shashachta al misha mechuyev chatos psula. Let's say a person slaughters a chatos for somebody that's chayev a chatos, so then it's disqualified, meaning you have in mind for someone else who has to bring a chatos, that's disqualified. But al misha mechuyev ola, but let's say you have in mind for somebody who's chayev an ola, a different person, not a person who's chayev a chatos, but a person who's chayev an ola, so then kasher, then it's kosher, and that seems to be the exact opposite logic. Alma, we see, devar mina machreba, that if it's of the same kind, that's more problematic. In that case, it destroys it, it disqualifies. The lav mina, but if it's not of the same kind, like it's for somebody who's chayiv an ola, instead of someone who's chayiv a chatos, lo machreba, so then that does not disqualify. So that seems to be a contradiction. Again, shinoi kodesh to shinoi bailim. And the Gemara continues, Umeshani, and he resolved the contradiction as follows. Hasam over there, V'shachat osal lechatos. It says that he's going to slaughter it as a chatos. Amar Achmona, that's what the pasuk says. V'harei chatos l'shem chatos nishchata. And in the case of Shinoi Kodesh, so if he slaughtered the chatos as a chatos, even though it was for a different chait, even though, let's say again, it was for dam instead of chaylev, but it was still a chatos l'shem chatos, and therefore, based on the pasuk, we say that that is kashera. But hachabit over here, when we're talking about Shinoi Bailim, V'chiper olav ksiv, it says that it's a kapara for him, it's an atonement for him. Allah velo al chaveiro means to say him and not his friend. And we understand that to mean chaveiro dum yodidei, that his friend is similar to him, shemechuyev kapara kamoso. In other words, he has a similar kapara. So we're talking specifically about chaveiro, where he is also obligated to bring a chata. So in that situation, you have in mind for that other person who's obligated in a similar kind of carbon, in a chatas, that's where it's problematic. And the Gemara continues, Rav Chaviva Rami Shinoi Bailam Atoch Tocho Meshani. Rav Chaviva, he said there was a contradiction between the case of Shinoi Bailam, again, when the person has intention for a different owner, and the case of Toch Tocho that we mentioned before, Umeshani, and again he resolves that contradiction as follows. Umi Amar Rava, does Rava really say Chatas Shashachta Al Misha Mechuyev Chatas Psula, that if a Chatas is slaughtered for someone else who's Chayev a Chatas, then it's disqualified. But Al Misha Mechuyev Ola, but if it's slaughtered for someone else who's Chayev an Ola, then Kasher, it's kosher. Alma d'mina machriba, lav mina lo machriba. And again, you see from that ruling that if it's of the same kind, then it disqualifies, it destroys. If it's not of the same kind, it does not destroy. V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, tocho v'lo toch tocho. Again, something within the earthenware vessel. Let's say you have an earthenware vessel with a sheretz inside, and then food goes into the earthenware vessel. So tocho. So then, if it's within the earthenware vessel, it becomes tameh. But not if it's toch tocho. Not if the food, let's say, is inside a vessel which is inside the earthenware vessel. And afilu kli shetef matzil, and even if it's a different kind of vessel, as we said, it's a kli shetef. Let's say, for example, it is a metal vessel. Even that will protect. And again, as we said, matzil is the same thing as machriv ba. It's considered to be different. It's considered to be toch tocho. And so here you see, even if it's not of the same kind, essentially you see machriv ba. So it seems to be a contradiction. Umeshani, and he resolved the contradiction as follows: Arba tocho ksivi. It says tocho 4 times. Toch tocho toch tocho. In other words, we darshan it as 4 separate drushas as follows: Chad lagufe, 1 is for the halach itself. We'll see Rashi in a moment. V'chad l'gzeir shava, 1's for the gzeir shava. Also, we'll see in Rashi. Chad tocho shel zev v'lo tocho shel acher. The other one is to say that inside this, but not inside a different kind of vessel. And idach, and finally the 4th one, that's our halacha. Tocho v'lo toch tocho. It has to be in it, but not in something that's in it. V'afilu kli shetef matzil. And again, in the drasha tells us that even a kli shetef is able to protect it from becoming tameh. And Rashi explains, Arba tocho ksivi, it says tocho 4 times. Ketzad, how so? Tocho trezimni, it actually says tocho 2 times. V'darsh, and Yadarshan as follows: Toch, v'darsh tocho. Every time it says tocho, Yadarshan it as toch and as tocho. Dahavim motzi l'michtav el toch. It could have just said el toch. Uchsiv tocho. Instead it says tocho. L'meuta, that's an exclusion. V'chein b'chaver, and the same is true by the other word tocho. Chad l'gufe, so one is just to teach you the halach itself. Sheyitma ochlin me'avir, meaning the food that's in the airspace of this kli cheres is going to be tameh. Tame. V'chad l'gzer shava, one is used for a gzer shava, sheyitma sheretz esakli, that let's say a sheretz is in the vessel, it's metame the vessel. V'yafa bishalo naga, even though it didn't touch. K'diyolef leba hakol shochten, like we learn in hakol shochten and chulin. Nemar tocho li tame, v'nemar tocho li tame, it says tocho to become tame, it says tocho to cause tuma. V'lo tocho shalacher, and then one of them is used for not inside something else, meaning lemu'ute kli shetef mitumas avir, el imke naga, when it comes to kli shetef, there is no such thing as tuma from something that's in the airspace, it has to actually touch it. And finally, Rashi says, V'chad tocho v'lo toch tocho, the last one is for tocho and not toch tocho, and again that says that if you have a kli within the kli cheres, so then that's going to be matzil. Kideforishas la'el, like I explained earlier. V'al karchach, and Rashi says you have to say, Iker kra l'chli shetef asa, that the pasuk, the main thing the pasuk is talking about is a chli shetef inside the earthenware vessel, meaning to say, if we're talking about a vessel in the vessel, that vessel protects the food inside of it, so that doesn't have to be a kli shetef, that could just be another earthenware vessel. So Rashi says, no, the pasuk must be talking about kli shetef and saying that is matzil. Why? Because if the pasuk was talking about an earthenware vessel that was in the tanur, inside this other earthenware vessel, and again its opening is above the opening of the tanur of the oven, and the pasuk is saying that protects the food inside of it. So lama li vav yasera, but then why would we need the extra vav? You wouldn't need to learn that from the extra vav. Lemute to exclude that. Lichtov, instead it could have just written kol asher besoch yitma, would have said anything inside of it. Umehechi teisi l'tamoya ochlam shebepnimi. So then why would we ever think that food that's inside something in an inner vessel is tamei? Only things inside, not things that are in an inner vessel. Halav tocho ninu, because that wouldn't qualify as tocho because it's really inside something else. Ela l'lamed al kli shetef. So rather, if you're going to already have the extra vav, that's to say that this is true even by kli shetef. Sha'af hu yatzel, that even if you have kli shetef, that is going to save, that's going to protect. The lo tema, that you shouldn't say the lav minei lav machrev bei, that since it's not of the same kind, so it doesn't destroy, so to speak. Hilkach gezeres hakosav. Therefore, in any case, the point is this is all gezeres hakosav, and that resolves the contradiction. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Dalid Amud Aleph.